Good afternoon, Oh, well, that's the wrong screen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Moonlit Theology. I am your host, Isaiah. A show I'm your resident kind of armchair historian, I guess, is the best way to describe it. Not professionally trained or anything, but sharing our views on these kind of things are important no matter who you are. So I thought I would bring it up and into play. Thank you for anybody that's joining us. As always, this podcast is recorded live over on TikTok and Twitch and then uploaded elsewhere, so you can catch us there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Today, we are actually going to be discussing canonization of the Bible. Of those who are video can see, and those who are audio, we do have a presentation to go along with this, but it's not required. We're going to be talking about a few things today. A lot of it is we're wrapping up our system. Our mini series, three-part series on the actual structure of the Bible. And we're going to be wrapping it up, of course, with the history of the biblical text and kind of where it comes from. As we kind of talked about in the first episode, it was compiled well before the New Testament and then compiled over the course of a couple hundred years by the New Testament. Now we're discussing kind of how it was decided, what was chosen, what was not, and of course, kind of the reasons behind it, because unlike what a lot of people say, the Bible wasn't just collected by a random group of people. It was in a summit somewhere. While it was canonized in the sense, it wasn't chosen for no reason, and it was decided for those reasons. So we're going to get into those. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament, we can kind of talk about this. The big thing we're going to be looking at is preservation, because we all know that the biblical text has been translated and translated and translated. So we want to know how much or how little has gone. How much or how little we have lost in those translations. And the good news is, as we know, we're not losing a lot. And most of it's just because there is linguistic differences there. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the Old Testament. And of course, Old Testament copying methods, because the Old Testament wasn't just put together. It was a culture that maintained it in very specific ways. Jewish copying methods were so stringent that mistakes would mean sometimes the entire document is destroyed. Sometimes it meant that they couldn't write specific things until after they were gone through ritual purification. This is important because this, even though this is non-Christian stuff, it is still a good way of tracing, like, oh, this is why the Old Testament is the way that it is now. And that, of course, comes down to our the Jewish copying methods. They had a big scroll. Somebody within the Jewish community, not necessarily community, but within the synagogue, would come forward, and they would put decades into writing out these scrolls. And that's important because if they made mistakes, sometimes they had to destroy the whole page. Sometimes they had to destroy the whole parchment. Sometimes the entire scroll got taken out because they made such a critical blunder. And so when you look at these different things, you realize that copying the text was a religious act and a worshiping act. And so they treated it with with such methodology and with such stringent rule sets that you can go through older documents and find where the translations, where maybe the language shifts, where it didn't. And honestly, we have a bunch of ancient manuscripts, which is phenomenal. Of course, everybody brings up the Dead Sea Scrolls when you're mentioning the preservation of the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls are just fractions. That's the biggest thing. Those are just fractions. The good news is we can compare those fractions to other texts. And so one thing that they do is they compare it to something called the Leningrad Codex. Now, if you don't know what a codex is an old term for a book. A codex is just an older term for a big book, essentially. There's other translations, but codex isn't something mystical or anything like that. It is just a book. And so when they say the Leningrad Codex, it is because the Leningrad Codex is one of the oldest copies we have. We have the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex from 930 CE and 1110 CE, respectively, and they line up remarkably well. And additionally, the Dead Sea Scroll fragments. I always say this. It's important when people bring up the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are fragments, not the full text. They are fragments. But they help trace a line in the preservation of the Old Testament going forward. Because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's from between 200 and 0 BCE. I should have written that down. I wish I had it. But more recently, the most recent texts we have are Aleppo and Leningrad, our oldest current copies of the Old Testament, not including fragments. We have numerous fragments from the Old Testament that are sitting in museums being studied. I think that's very important for a text, especially something as important as biblical text and Old Testament text, is that we get these into scientific hands and we get them to look at them as from an archaeological perspective, because it's not a secret religion. The Bible isn't meant to be a religion of secrets. Christianity, Judaism aren't supposed to be secret religions. What do we call them? What are they called? They have a specific term historically. Gosh, wow, my brain is not working after our big live stream. But the texts need to be in front of archaeologists. Our oldest texts, throw them in front of archaeologists, because they're the ones that are going to study it. They're the ones that can say, dude, the Dead Sea Scrolls line up with the Aleppo Codex and with the Leningrad Codex pretty well. And so because of that, we can trace that preservation, and we know their histories. So that kind of thing goes into that. Of course, when you get out of the Old Testament, things get more tricky with the New Testament. More tricky, less tricky. Different types of things. We have less fragments of the New Testament. We have more completed works of the New Testament. So when we move from preservation of the Old Testament and the Torah and everything from the Jewish perspective into the New Testament, which is, okay, newer books, how were they preserved? How are they maintained? Now, we have significant early manuscripts. We have partial copies. We've got the P90, P102, both coming from the 2nd century. Why is that important? Because that's the P90 and P104. I believe P90 was sections of the Gospel of Matthew, and P104 was sections of the Gospel of John. These are both segments of the New Testament put into circulation before they had been written down. The New Testament didn't have as a strict rules for copying as the Jewish faith did. Many of them were Jewish, so a lot of them did carry over some of those practices. But we have a lot more manuscripts, and those fragments being from the 2nd century AD, and this is another thing, these things are not in some Jewish crypt, some Christian crypt or Vatican crypt somewhere. They're in the hands of a couple of museums, and so I think that's important. I said it before. I think it's important that we get historical evidence into the hands of scientists, because I would much rather have things authenticated by them than held in religious regard for no reason. So putting these in the hands of scientists can help strengthen the argument for the historical creation of the Bible. Additionally, in completed copies, we have the Codex Vaticanus, the Vatican Codex, written in the 4th century. We have the Codex Sinaiticus, written in the 4th century, and we have the Codex Alexandrinus, written in the I flubbed that on the presentation, written in the 5th century. Now, the reason why I separated those ones is because completed copies matter just as much as partial copies, but completed copies preserve a different thing because it preserves the language of the entire New Testament. Now, the reason why these are important and why we don't see something coming out of, say, 0 AD is because, one, it took time for these to be written by the apostles, by the people around them, to be compiled together, and then that's kind of what we're going to get at next, is we're going to talk about why did they choose these books? Why were these books decided? And that goes into what was preserved and what isn't. We have thousands of manuscripts from the time period. The languages can be a bit different. The wording is mostly similar, but the languages are very different, partially because these weren't necessarily made by scholars, not all of them. Now, the Codex Vaticanus, I talked about that. That is the one that currently is what they are utilizing to directly translate for modern versions of the text, which is great because now we have a link between the 4th century copies and the 21st century copies. And that is a great thing. We want those links. Additionally, these things are in the hand of scientists. I always say this, put the copies in the hands of scientists, because if it's true, let the scientists prove it, because they will prove it. They've got no reason not to. So let the science go forward. Don't hold these things. I really don't like that, and I'm gonna a little bit of a different soapbox here. I really don't like it when religions are all secretive with the text. I live in Utah. We have a thing called the LDS Church, only a couple of 100 years ago, and they say they have all these relics, but they won't show them to anybody. They say they have their golden tablets up in the mountains locked away, but they refuse to put them in front of scientists. And so I'm like, please, no, put the text in front of scientists. Any self-respecting like Christian or anybody who would want like truth to prevail either way, put it in front of scientists. They will prove the truth. And let them look at it. Let them study it. Let the studies come out. Let the research come out. Because it's like, great. Now you only strengthen your claim when you put it in front of scientists. And that's very important for anything. If you have a belief about something, put it in front of scientists. Let it become public. Let it become peer reviewed. Let people analyze. Let it critique. Let them try to break it down. That way, the truth prevails, and the strength of that truth prevails. I'm going to get off my soapbox on that real quick because we're going to be talking about canonization. Now, let me talk about canonization of the Bible, because this is a hot topic. This is a very hot topic for a lot of non-Christians and within Christians as well. We don't really talk about them. It's really weird. You don't hear too much about the councils. So we didn't talk about this is important because this is about how the Bible was decided and where. What was decided at Hippo? What was decided at Carthage? What was decided at Nicaea? We're actually going to start reverse here. We're going to talk about Nicaea because this is even something that I fell into and I got corrected on, and I'm always thankful for correction. The Council of Nicaea did not decide anything about the Bible. That's very important. The Council of Nicaea solidified what the core beliefs of Christianity is. It had nothing to do with choosing biblical text. And I think that's something very important. This is where we get something called the Nicene Creed. Essentially, it is the core beliefs of the Christianity, and we'll talk about the Nicene Creed later. And you can go look it up. Anybody can look up the Nicene Creed. The Council of Nicaea was in the 2nd century. They got a bunch of church leaders together, elders, bishops of the newly founding church together at Nicaea, and said, what do we actually believe? What's common? What do we believe? They came up with the Nicene Creed. All of them took that oath, and you can track that as the Nicene Creed is. If you want to know exactly, it's going to be complicated. It's not simple. If you want to know the nitty-gritty of exactly what Christians believe, it is the Nicene Creed. Because that's what was decided there is we believe this. This is what we believe. And I can talk about it. I can go through it, but I think it's going to be boring. We're going to be going through the full thing in another episode as we get into what we believe. The Nicene Creed is really important because it's a good way of kind of shrinking everything down and being like, okay, core beliefs right here, and everything else later. Now then you get into the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage. Now, what the Council of Hippo is, they're the ones that got all the books and went through them in the 4th century and said, here's all the copies of the books that we have, and that has been distributed out. These are all the books that the Christians believe in. Which ones are the Bible? Which ones are truly do we put together as the Bible? And they had criteria. And that's really important is people say they just threw it together. No, they had criteria. And these councils specifically talked about the criteria of these books. So it was decided at Hippo and solidified at Carthage. Carthage did the same thing. Hippo got together with all the books and said, here's our criteria that we're going on. Here's all the books that fit that criteria. Here's the Bible. And then at Carthage, they went through those same books and said, has anything changed? No? Great. Here's the books. We are canonizing it. And after that point, you can solidify these were the books of the Bible. These were the stuff that were not in there. And I'm not just going in vague and saying they had criteria. Oh, no. We're talking about the criteria next. We're talking about the criteria of the New Testament. And that's very important, is knowing why these were decided to solidify kind of, hey, this is the beliefs. It wasn't just thrown together for no reason. Because we liked these books, it was thrown together because of these reasons. The first thing was apostolic origin. Now, that is a word some of you may not hear very often. Apostolic origin is essentially their origin is from the apostles. The 12 that follow Jesus, we can trace the origin of these books to them or their students that wrote it down, because not all of them were writers. So we can track it. We can go, okay, first person account, second person account. Great. Here, apostolic origin. Who wrote it? Why? Do we know when? And of course, what was their link to the apostles? If they didn't have a link to the apostles, why are they writing a book? That was the biggest kind of question of, hey, these are supposed to be accounts of Jesus' life and later the letters of Paul. Why are we not paying attention to who wrote it? I think that's very important. Is like, hey, that's one of the main decision makings was apostolic origin. And keep in mind, it wasn't just like they came together and said this. Widespread use was another big thing. Do we all believe the same things? Because there's a lot of regional books. There's a lot of regional books that weren't talked about that people essentially just said, trust me, bro. And some churches used and nobody else used because they were like, well, if we put together our beliefs of the books of the Bible and get a church together, if you're teaching something wonky over there from this random book written by some guy in your town claiming to know Jesus, we have some problems. We have some problems. So widespread use. We can go, okay, these are the books that spread to all of them. These are the ones that kind of stayed regional, and they avoided putting regional books within there. So it's like, okay, the truth disseminates. It was the big idea there. So apostolic origin, widespread use, antiquity was another thing they took into account. How old is the book? How old is our earliest copy of the book? How old do we actually have it? And in the 400s, it's like, okay, keep in mind, most of our copies are coming from 100 AD, 200 AD. Are they old enough to have been written in the time period that the Bible was written in? That was another thing. Those were the main things. Like antiquity, was it right? Was it written in the correct time period? Apostolic origin, what was their connection to the apostles? And is it widespread throughout the church? Those were the criteria for deciding the canon of the Bible. And from there, the councils got together and said, here's the books of the Bible. And of course, the last one was consistency of teaching. Because there's some books that passed these, sort of. Widespread use, we're going to take a couple into account here, and we're going to talk about them. We're going to take two examples, and I think that's really important. We're going to be taking the Gospel of Thomas, and we're going to be taking one of the favorites out there, the Book of Enoch. And we're going to be taking a look at them and why they weren't put in. And within these, why they don't fit the criteria. The first and foremost is the Book of Enoch. Now, fascinating, the Book of Enoch has a very different criteria. This one big thing, the Book of Enoch was mainly thrown out because of questions of of authorship and consistency of preservation. Now, what that means is, fun fact, Enoch is not a New Testament book. The Book of Enoch was designed as a Jewish text and intended as a Jewish text. So the Book of Enoch being a Jewish text, it's one of those things, and claiming to be a Jewish text, they're like, this was weird. It doesn't have the same preservation of the other Old Testament texts. They didn't fit the same copying methods. Additionally, there were 3 versions of the Book of Enoch that were going around. So they didn't, and they were all claimed to be written around 200, but they're like, we don't know where these came from. They started popping up out there. Even within like a lot of Jewish sects, they didn't all take them in Enoch. They're like, we have questions about this, questions of its authorship, who actually wrote it, widespread use, and not consistent preservation. They're like, this doesn't fit how the Jewish people would have preserved their text. And so that's why Enoch was set out, because we're like, we don't know. We don't know. And I really can appreciate the fact that if they said, we have questions about this thing that don't fit, we are not going to include it. Because if we don't know who wrote it, and it's not exactly widespread even among Jewish communities, and it's not preserved in the same way as Old Testaments. Why are we putting this in here? And I really like that kind of idea of like, hey, no, we took what they had, the criteria. It's like, we know these to be true. We know these to be real texts written around these actual accounts. And then, of course, the second one we're going to be talking about is the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Gospel of Thomas, it was left out for a couple of reasons. One, it was written in the 2nd century. Now, that isn't a big deal. A lot of the texts were written in the 2nd century, but they could not trace it anywhere older, even when it wasn't written down. Because a lot of these, if they didn't have a textual, they had an oral history. And so it's like, okay, that questions antiquity, time period. It was likely written around the 2nd period. It was very limited in its use. So it wasn't widespread throughout the old church. And because it wasn't widespread, people are going, what do we do with this? It's claiming to be Thomas's, but additionally, we don't know if it's really that or if it's written by somebody else. Questions of actual authorship and apostolic connection. It didn't pass the sniff test. And the last bit where it was probably one of the final nails in the coffin for the Gospel of Thomas, instead of putting it in the book, it taught something different. It taught something very different that contradicted the other books, and not just what it taught about was Gnosticism. And I'm just throwing a word out there. You guys may not know it. What a Gnosticism is the idea of secret knowledge. And the idea that the Gospel of Thomas teaches that you gain power and you gain salvation through this secret knowledge of Christ. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty contradictory to the rest of the book, isn't it? To the rest of the New Testament. And so the Gospel of Thomas was likely left out because they couldn't verify who wrote it. It wasn't widespread nearly as much as it could be. And it taught stuff that contradicted the original text, the chosen text. And they're like, yeah, best leave it out. Whether you consider it canon or not, it's like, okay, best leave it out. Because if you're establishing a church and saying, here is the foundation of our church, here's the foundational books of our faith, you shouldn't have questions about where those books came from. You shouldn't have questions about who wrote them. You shouldn't have questions about, do we all believe the same thing? In the early church, it was very important that they knew where their texts came from. A lot of them were from the Jewish faith, which had history and had copying methods and had so much behind them of, hey, we can back up our text throughout history. Whereas the Christians, coming from that, they wanted that same thing. And I think it's important to look at not only what was in, but what was left out and the reasons behind it. Examples of why it was canonized. And so that very much establishes which books are the Bible. Later we have the Protestant Reformations, and we got questions. We can get into that when we talk about the Reformation. But for right now, I think that's very important right now, is just be like, here is why we chose what we chose. Here's why it was decided. And why we left out certain texts. The reason why we're talking about it the way we're talking about it, you notice this feels a lot like a history lecture. It's because I don't want to be here and saying, take it on faith when there's evidence. The point of faith is in the absence of evidence. When there is evidence, you take the evidence first. That's very important to belief and Christianity. It's like when you study your history, it's not, I believe it, I have faith that it was written correctly. No, we have reasons why it was written correctly. We have reasons why it was written correctly. We have methods of tracing back. We have archaeological record behind it, and we can trace it all the way back there. And so that's very important within these Christian spaces, to not just blindly say we're taking it on faith, but to say, do we have evidence? Christianity, you're supposed to question. You can question. I really don't like the idea of blind faith and blind Christianity, where you're like, oh, if there's evidence, I have no reason to go look for it. No. Go look for the reason first. Go look for the evidence. Evidence is really important. And so when you start digging into oh yes, why were these books chosen? You get, oh, that's why they were chosen. Apostolic connection? Great. They were linked to the apostles. Why did apostolic connection? I've got them right here. Widespread use, antiquity, and consistency of teaching. That's very important when you're establishing an old book and an old canon to it and tracing it throughout the years, because again, we can go backwards from there. Okay, why were these chosen? Here's where they were chosen. Here's the proofs that we have that these were chosen. And it's like you can trace it back. Evidence is really important, and Christian faith is really important to be like, yes, we have the evidence behind it. We can back it up. Book of Enoch. And of course, like always, this is where we would be wrapping. Our audio will be wrapping up here. Our Q&As in our recorded podcast are cut out. I would think if you have questions or you'd like to hear more, you can always join us live. Right now we're going to be opening it to a Q&A. So everybody who's listening to the recording later or watching the recording later, we thank you for joining us. Please follow, like, subscribe wherever you're listening to it. Tip the bellhop, help us out there. And of course, share us with your friends, your Christian friends, non-Christian friends, anybody who has questions about this, because that's very important. Is that, give me just a second. I am going to pull up text to speech real quick as we get into our Q&A, and everybody have a great Holy Week and a great Tuesday. God bless you guys, and we'll catch you guys later. Everybody else, let's begin that Q&A.